I'm Virginia Birrell, the CEO of the Australia-China Business Council in Victoria, and I warmly welcome you all to our leadership series today. We've got over 250 guests attending, and we're just delighted at the response to the invitation we sent out. The leadership series is designed to offer members and the wider community the opportunity to hear from leading speakers who work on the increasingly complex global stage, and to get their views on the historical context, current issues and opportunities afforded by our trading relationship with China. We're certainly working in a rapidly changing business and political environment, and it's never been more important to understand the past and present as we work towards a brighter future. Statements from Beijing, Canberra and Washington have many concerned, and amongst the economic fallout from the COVID-19 pandemic, we see the need to strengthen people-to-people ties and maintain long-standing relationships for the future benefit of our country. The fundamental strength of Australia's exports has been the affluent Chinese middle class's appetite for Australia's natural resources, clean, green agricultural products, education, healthy lifestyle products, medical and scientific research. The long-term impact of COVID-19, layered with the worsening diplomatic relations, is therefore deeply concerning. Additionally, Australia now finds itself placed between two great powers. So how do we navigate the complexities of working with our long-term security and cultural ally, the USA, and our vitally important regional trading partner, China? And with the November elections looming in the USA, the rhetoric and publicity around the Trump presidential campaign has brought with it further issues. To learn more about the nuances of the Australia, China, USA trilogy, I'm delighted to introduce John Fitzgerald, Emeritus Professor in the Centre for Social Impact at Swinburne University of Technology in Melbourne, where he heads the Asia Pacific Philanthropy Studies program. John holds a PhD from the ANU and held a Fulbright postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Following John's presentation, we'll hear from Rowan Callick. Rowan is a public speaker, author and Walkley Award-winning media writer, world-renowned for his China commentary. We warmly welcome him today to present on the importance of the personal, cross-border business relationships to deepen understanding of the dynamic and rapidly recovering. Following John and Rowan's presentations, there'll be the opportunity for Q&A. And we ask you to submit your questions via the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen and put them in there during the presentations, please. We've got a record number of attendees and we'll do our best to get through them in the time available. A reminder that this event will be recorded and uploaded to the Insights Centre on the ACBC website following the event. To conclude the event, we will hear from Matt Schofield, the President of ACBC Victoria. And it's now my pleasure to hand over to Professor John Fitzgerald. Thank you, John.
Thank you very much, Virginia, for the opportunity to speak to your members and associates. And good afternoon all. I think we'd all agree it's difficult to see any kind of future for Australia that doesn't involve China in a pretty big way, in trade, in investment, in security, in policing, in educational and cultural exchanges, in migration, and much else besides. So ensuring a secure and prosperous future for Australia means getting the relationship with China right. For some years, Beijing's been telling us that we've got it quite wrong, and Australians engaged in business, in government, in community, in media, in think tanks and elsewhere have been debating what exactly has gone wrong and what can be done to improve things. And emerging from this debate is, I'd suggest, a widespread recognition, or at least a growing recognition, that it's China that's changed and not Australia. Adjusting our policy settings to match doesn't mean rejecting trade or engagement on other fronts, but it possibly means rethinking relations from the bottom up. This year, we have an additional complicating factor in the pandemic, COVID-19, which has thrown travel and business and public trust into disarray. As Alan DuPont and others have noted, the coronavirus has exposed the fragility of just-in-time supply chains and the folly of relying on a single country for critical goods and infrastructure. some economic separation is unavoidable and necessary, end quote. And for the past 4 years, we've had an additional complicating factor, American President Donald Trump. It's the Trump factor in Australia-China relations that's the prime focus of my comments here today. For Australia, by way of background, the big challenge is this. We are partly dependent on China for our prosperity, in fact, considerably dependent on China for our prosperity, largely dependent on the United States for our military security, but more dependent than either of those two great countries on the norms and institutions of a stable international order for managing our trade, for our international relations, and for our security. Neither China under Chairman Xi Jinping, nor the US under President Donald Trump is committed to upholding the old order, which we rather value. So where does that leave us, Australia? Now, this question could lead us in many directions, but in these few minutes, I'd propose to isolate the Trump factor in the trilateral relations along three separate, shall we say, bilateral vectors. One is US-China relations, one is Australia-US relations, and the other is Australia-China relations. Australia-China, US-China, Australia-US. And then to conclude with a few remarks about Chairman Xi Jinping and to ask where we might go from here. Now, to isolate the Trump factor in Australia-China relations, we need to ask whether Australia's problems with China arise from excessive deferral to Trump, as some distinguished Australians have claimed, or in fact spring from other sources. And we can answer this question, it seems to me, historically, that is, when did relations start turning sour, but also forensically, what exactly curdled the relationship? So I propose to take each of these approaches in turn. First, to plot a plausible timeline. If we want to find a plausible timeline for souring relations, in fact, we soon find that the later people stumble upon this problem of Australia-China relations, the more recently they tend to identify the trigger or attribute the cause and blame. Here in Melbourne, and I know we're all over Australia, but here in Melbourne, we still hear on radio comments to the effect that things started to go wrong when Minister Payne called for an international inquiry into the origins of the COVID-19 pandemic. That was just a few months ago. Now, those of us who've been in the business for a while, and I'm sure all our members and associates have, would know this isn't quite right. In 2019, we were told it was because Australia banned Huawei from the national 5G build. In 2018, it seemed the problem stemmed from legislation introduced to underpin the FITS scheme, the Foreign Influence Transparency Scheme. In 2015 and 16, deteriorating relations tended to be attributed to what was called a China panic in the media over political donations and other shenanigans involving the New South Wales Labor right. And before that again, in 2014, the chill in relations was attributed to the Abbott government's expression of concern over China's declaration of an Air Defence Identification Zone, or ADIZ, in the East China Sea. And you might recall that in December 2013, and that's some time ago now, Foreign Minister Wang Yi bluntly characterised Canberra's position on the ADZ declaration as jeopardising mutual trust and placing relations at risk. And between times, of course, we've been told the chill turned to a freeze when Canberra spoke out about Beijing's rejection of the international arbitral decision on China's claims over the South China Sea in 2016. Australia's public position on that issue, the South China Sea, led to speculation in China that Australia was growing increasingly anti-China, some said racist, and a call in Chinese media for Beijing to exact revenge, I seem to recall. Now, that was 2016. Trump took office in January 2017. We were well into this problem before Trump appeared on the scene. So clarifying the timeline of the problem helps us say when relations turned sour, but they can also help us explain what went wrong, that is, why they turned sour. And from this brief chronology, I'd suggest that formal relations deteriorated from the moment China declared an ADZ back in 2013, and then progressively occupied and militarized contested islands in the South China Sea and laid claim to waters within its fabulous 9-dash line, that is, maritime territorial claims. Now just think about this. It's worth recalling that Beijing's attempts to infiltrate Australia's political systems and communities were initially directed towards this very same purpose on this issue, supporting action in the South China Sea. After all, it was a news conference on the South China Sea that tripped up Senator Sam Dastyari. Businessman Huang Xiangmo's threat to withhold a major political donation hinged on whether Labor changed its public pitch on the South China Sea. And the first public alerts over the United Front operations in community organisations were raised when some community associations closely linked to consulates began pressuring ministers, local politicians, even the Prime Minister at one point, on the South China Sea issue. And they were also involved in coordinating street protests in support of China's occupation of those maritime territories. So it seems to me there is a real and substantial issue here, and that much flows from that. Some at the time in the media and in independent community organisations raised their concerns. So did the Australian government, and this was enough to trigger accusations from Beijing that Canberra was undermining mutual trust way back in 2013. And the rest, I'd suggest, flows from there. The public debates in the media, the attempts to influence politicians, the exposure of those attempts, the tripwires set in place for Senator Sam Dastyari and others in the New South Wales Labor right, the Fitz scheme, the FITS, the Huawei decision, and the precipitous decline in popular trust. These events, it seems to me, cascade one after the other from China's initial territorial intrusions and its efforts to persuade and in some cases silence Australian community and government concerns. Now, seen from Australia's position, and we can perhaps look at China's position a little later, this was simply textbook independent foreign policy. Every one of the apparent triggers that I've identified here for deteriorating relations over a period of 6 or 7 years has involved Australian governments acting without external prompting in defence of international order, social cohesion within Australia, and national sovereignty. Every one of these initiatives was generated in Australia by Australians to address a domestic or a regional issue. I'm leaving aside COVID here, which, as I said, is an outlier and is immensely complicated matters. But DFAT Secretary Francis Adamson recently explained, it seems to be, the central problem this way. We've seen China seeking to assert itself in this region, in the Indo-Pacific and globally, in ways that suit its interests, but don't suit the interests of countries like Australia. It's as simple as that. In some, the relationship was heading into troubled waters years before Trump took office, because Canberra's defence of Australian interests and sovereignty in response to Beijing's assertive behaviour was not welcomed in Beijing, and we were made to feel that it was not welcome. Now, I'd like to come to US-China relations at this point, because that too is a significant factor in Australia's relations with China and with the United States. During President Trump's term, relations between China and the US have moved arguably from great power competition to great power rivalry. This move possibly reflects a long-term shift in the balance of power regionally and globally, but it undoubtedly reflects a new consensus in Washington, reaching well beyond the Trump White House to business, think tanks, universities and elsewhere, that the days of partnership and engagement with China are behind the United States. In the words of a senior Obama administration official, Kurt Campbell and Jake Sullivan, I quote, "While Washington remains bitterly divided on most issues, there's a growing consensus that the era of engagement with China has come to an unceremonious close. The debate is over. The debate is now over what comes next." In fact, significant differences are emerging from this debate in Washington that we need to pay attention to. Team Trump is certainly calling for strategic competition. In May this year, Mr. Trump signed a new document on China policy, the United States Strategic Approach to the People's Republic of China, which clearly signaled all-out strategic competition. And in July, Mr. Trump's executive team spelled out what this meant in a series of coordinated speeches on relations with China. These involved major statements by Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, Attorney General Bill Barr, Defense Secretary Mark Esper, FBI Director Christopher Wray, and National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien. And following this full court press, China and the world were left in little doubt that the Trump administration regards China as a strategic and as an ideological rival. But on the Democratic side, we're hearing a slightly different line of argument emerging, less ideological and more finely attuned to discrete aspects of US-China relations. Samantha Power, a Security Council member in the first Obama administration and later US ambassador to the UN, told a Lowy Institute seminar just last month that a Biden administration could pursue China policy on a number of discrete tracks. Confrontation, when it comes to intellectual property or cybersecurity or the South China Sea. Competition around competing national economic interests and the leadership of international organizations. And cooperation in critical areas such as climate change, global health, and nuclear non-proliferation. This many-faceted approach, combining elements of competition and cooperation, marks an emerging consensus on the Democratic side of politics over the past year, at least as I read that. Still, beyond Washington debating circles, the real-world US-China relationship is not improving. In the judgment of American political scientist Jude Blanchett, the deterioration in US-China relations is more than incremental. It amounts to an entirely new paradigm, whichever government is in office, defined, and I quote, by a proliferation of flashpoints, a downward spiral of hostility, a rise in zero-sum thinking, and the breakdown of mediating and mitigating institutions. And I think we need to pay particular attention to that, both in the United States and Australia. It's the risk of the breakdown of mediating and mitigating institutions. So thirdly, Australia-US relations. Now, I'm sure many of us were in a way surprised on reading of Foreign Minister Marise Payne's fairly blunt remarks following the AUSMIN meeting in Washington, DC in July, just a few months ago, clearly distancing the Australian government from Trump's White House on relations with China. Minister Payne declined to endorse Secretary Pompeo's frankly ideological position, and she distinguished clearly between Australia and the United States interests and perspectives as they bear on China. And I quote, "The Secretary's speeches are his own," she said. Australia's positions are our own. We do share values," she went on, "but most importantly, from our perspective, we make our own decisions, our own judgments in the Australian national interest and about upholding our security, our prosperity, and our values. And we deal with China in the same way," unquote. In fact, there should have been little cause for surprise, as Canberra has been distancing itself from Washington on a range of issues over the term of the Trump presidency. And Canberra's differences with Washington are not just around China policy by any means. They arise from systemic issues to do with Australia's standing as a middle power, dependent on international trade and a predictable rules-based order. Middle powers fear disruption. Australia's a middle power. Donald Trump is the great disruptor. Maintaining a rules-based order is recognised as one of the three foreign policy imperatives that all governments assume in Australia when they take responsibility for our international relations. In Alan Gingel's memorable account, these are, first, sustaining and developing an international rules-based order. Secondly, allying with a strong global partner. And thirdly, finding a constructive place in our neighbourhood. Well, with the arrival of the great disruptor, Australia finds itself thrown into a kind of particle accelerator in which all fundamental principles are colliding with one another at once. Here, maintaining a close alliance partnership, they're pushing back against disruption to global trade and international organisations, and meanwhile, back in the neighbourhood, trying to find a welcome place in a region where China and the United States are competing for influence. Nothing is quite the same. But Australia is not alone in this particular tangle. Singapore Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong put it well. The troubled US-Chinese relationship raises profound questions about Asia's future and the shape of the emerging international order. it seems we're in this particle accelerator together, at least with some of our neighbours. For President Trump, of course, the big game is to make America great again. In practice, this has come to mean open hostility towards a number of key international organisations, indifference towards multilateral frameworks for trade or conflict resolution, a sometimes disheartening lack of commitment to long-standing alliance partners, and a propensity to impose tariffs and other arbitrary measures without regard to existing understandings or partnerships. And the Australian government has made its differences with the US clear on each of these issues over a number of years. I shan't go through that here. In a sense, Marise Payne was simply stating the obvious, but in this case, she was stating it about China. When it comes to the US, alliance politics is another matter again. To deal with President Trump, Australian officials have developed a kind of bespoke diplomacy suited to his very particular personal style, tailored to avoid an open clash with a petulant president, but without giving too much away. And this is what the Australian editor-at-large, Paul Kelly, calls the new diplomacy that nobody really wants to talk about. It involves pulling all available levers to secure the support of the Trump administration as an alliance partner, while distancing Canberra from Washington on particular issues over which the two sides are in substantial disagreement. Some of us may have read Joe Hockey's interview on his retirement, which offers remarkable insights into how this new diplomacy works. First up, government-to-government relations need to be personalised. Forget values, forget principles, forget institutions. Call Greg Norman. A second feature of the new diplomacy is its consistent focus on the two countries' long-standing military ties. The embassy devised a public relations campaign, I'm sure you're familiar with it, around the theme 100 years of mateship, which underscored Australia's record in military combat with the United States over the past century. And I quote Joe Hockey, "The more we spoke with the President and the White House, the more they realised Australia was different from every other country on earth." Well, aren't we all? This new bilateral diplomacy carries risks for Australia, including the risk of focusing relations exclusively on alliance politics, when in fact the relationship is far, far broader than that. This kind of military mateship carries ongoing obligations on both sides. But if defence agreements are not supported by public respect in Australia for the US, for its leadership and for its people, then those agreements may turn out to be worth very little. Moving on then, I'd just like to ask where we go from here. Let me summarise. Over President Trump's term, Australia's managed to retain close defence and security ties with the United States while distancing itself from Washington on important issues from multilateral trade to climate change and the role of international institutions, the WTO and the WHO and so on. This has involved highlighting the similarities that bind us in order to press home the policy differences that separate us. And that's an important point. There's a constant stress on what we have in common so that we'll articulate where we differ. Minister Payne put it well this way after the Osmin meeting this year. "We should be able to articulate in a mature and sensible way," she said, "the points on which we disagree in order to advance Australia's interests and values." With China, on the other hand, Australians' actions tend to surface the differences that divide the two and leave us scrambling to find points of similarity. And this is in part because the differences are not trivial. They are substantial, going beyond policy differences to values, to systems of government, to understanding of rule of law, and particular cultural differences, such as the Chinese government's extraordinary sensitivity to any kind of public criticism of its leadership or its policies. In fact, we do have much in common with China, and Australia and perhaps China could have articulated our difference at times in a more mature and sensible way, to borrow Minister Payne's words. But relations are unlikely to improve, in my judgment, so long as both sides, at least so long as Beijing fails to acknowledge that the source of the disagreement is substantial. It lies in its policies of maritime territorial expansion and associated interference in Australian domestic affairs. Sadly, Australia's relations with China appear to be deteriorating at roughly the same rate as US-China relations, despite substantial policy differences between Australia and the US, and despite Australia making these differences perfectly clear. Perhaps encouraged by some distinguished public figures in Australia, Beijing interprets Australian government conduct as a pale reflection of US government intentions. This is very misleading, the idea that Australia is simply following Trump, or is a dog barking America's wishes. Australian governments do not see Australia engaged in strategic competition with China. There was a time before Xi Jinping when both sides imagined there was scope for strategic alignment. That wasn't that long ago. You might recall in 2014, Australia and China agreed to move the relationship towards a comprehensive strategic partnership. Other dialogues that had been developed over 30 and more years were rolled into this new comprehensive strategic partnership. This was on the cusp of Xi Jinping announcing the arrival of his new era of socialism with Chinese characteristics, and he's since shown by his actions what this vision for the new era holds for China and the world. Australian governments and communities are not on the whole keen to align themselves with that vision. So ambitious bilateral programs designed to bring the two countries together in an earlier era are not particularly well suited to the present one. Still, we would want to preserve many of the older dialogues, the more substantial ones that were brought under the bilateral strategic umbrella, even if that strategic framework no longer persists. I'm thinking here of dialogues on trade, on international security, on law enforcement, on development cooperation, on climate change, and other new areas of potential cooperation as well. As flashpoints in the relations proliferate, the two countries need to maintain a number of mediating dialogues and institutions. This is absolutely critical. Seen from Beijing, Australia's been a constant irritant since Chairman Xi took office. But Australia will continue to say no on matters affecting its values and interests, and to say yes where it suits it as well. Australia has never said no to building a mutually beneficial relationship based on a realistic understanding of our points of agreement and disagreement, our similarities and differences. We do not propose to follow Trump's America and engage in all-round strategic competition. And there have been a number of proposals put forward by Australians about how to develop the relationship. I'd like to just put two forward here. The first, early in 2019, Macquarie University Professor Bates Gill put forward a new approach to the relationship he called bounded engagement. On this model, the challenges that China presents to Australia's values and interests are recognised as real and pressing. But Australia is seen to have every reason to continue engaging closely with China on as many fronts as possible. Almost all areas of the interaction would become more constrained, but some more constrained than others. And we need to identify those where we can move forward effectively with the minimum constraint. Then in September last year, a researcher at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, Charlie Lyons-Jones, put forward a similar model, but for broader application among liberal democracies generally, including those in North America. He suggested they should approach China not in Cold War fashion as a stark adversary, nor in the style of the past decades as a strategic partner, but through a combination of approaches, as adversary, as competitor, and as partner across discrete areas of engagement. And this idea has since gained currency in North America. China specialist Paul Evans, a highly respected proponent of Canada's earlier engagement strategy, wrote in the ANU East Asian Forum in July this year that Canada's engagement with China is teetering on the brink. And he wrote, Ottawa needs to come forward with an approach that frames Xi Jinping's China as a combination of adversary, rival, competitor, and partner, again, across discrete areas of engagement. And as I noted earlier, these echo similar ideas coming out of the debates in Washington, particularly those on the Democratic Party side, considering discrete areas of confrontation, competition, and cooperation. And if this does emerge as a growing liberal consensus for managing relations with an increasingly authoritarian China, I'd like to think it was a couple of analysts here in Australia who thought of it first. Thank you very much. I look forward to questions.
Thanks, John. That was terrific. And I think they're looking forward to alignment of programs on various issues, and I think mutually beneficial is the key takeaway. So that is wonderful. If I could now ask Rowan if you would like to make your presentation, after which we will have time for Q&A. So get those questions into the question box. Thank you.
Thanks
Rowan.
very much, Virginia, and good afternoon, everyone. Especially to my friends who have kindly joined us today. I'm going to talk principally in acknowledgement of the B in the ACBC about the Chinese economic setting, the crucial issue for those participating in this event, and then consider how in general terms people in business might respond to the changed circumstances in which we find ourselves. I'm a great user and admirer of the one-page fact sheets that DFAT provides, containing core economic details about every country in the world and about Australia's relationship with them. I looked again this morning at the China fact sheet, and it's a very comforting read. Merchandise exports in 2019, $135 billion, 26% up on 2018, and 36% of all our merchandise exports. 100 billion of this comes from just 4 commodities, of course: iron ore, gas, coal, and gold. Service exports to China, 18.5 billion, 8% up. China's own principal merchandise export destinations, US #1 with 19%, Japan next at 6%. China's import sources are Korea, Japan, Taiwan, in that order, close together, with Australia at a highly respectable 6th. But this, I suggest, is about as good as it's going to get for some time. Why is that? First, because China's economy is in some trouble. Second, because it's not getting help from its global engagement. The virtuous circle has turned bad. Third, because the politics is getting in the way of good policy, inside China and to an extent outside. And COVID's only a part of this. So China can't be expected to repeat its performance during the Asian financial crisis and again during the global financial crisis, of powering ahead sufficiently to bring the rest of the world back into acceptable growth with it. Its performance is still likely to be better than any other large economy. But for the high expectations of its people, for constantly rising prosperity as a reward for their hard work, and for their relinquishing to the ruling Chinese Communist Party considerable controls over their daily lives, as well as for us in Australia who've grown to expect China to have an appetite for an ever-increasing amount of our surplus production, this is quite a blow. The IMF is forecasting 1% growth for China this year, 5.4% for 2021. China's own government understandably opted in its National People's Congress work report not to provide a prediction at all this year. But to add a touch of silver lining, if still rather pallid, ANZ yesterday revised upwards its own 2020 forecast to 2.1%. On the back, it said, of a robust recovery in the services industry, thanks to news that China will have COVID-19 vaccines ready by year's end. But the bank added that longer term growth is again being driven by China's proactive fiscal policy, which will in turn rekindle concerns about the need for renewed deleveraging. Australia's markets, of course, always cheer such news as positive for iron ore and coking coal, even though it derives from a sugar hit that may not ultimately prove ideal for an economy overdue for reform. Economic policy, if not always implementation, was pretty consistent under the leadership of Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao. cautious and steady opening and modernization of production. But as the excellent book Red Capitalism by Fraser Howey and Carl Walter explains, the process got stuck in the crucial finance sector. The World Bank and leading Chinese economists and central bankers produced in 2012 a powerful report laying out a reform agenda to complete Deng Xiaoping's Kaifang vision. This would have steered the economy towards a new and more sustainable direction from being driven principally by imports and exports to services and domestic consumption. Xi Jinping's mind, as he took charge as party general secretary 8 years ago, was focused on his anti-corruption campaign to purge and purify the party, the key platform that had brought him to the senior leader's endorsement, rather than on the economy, though. So at the party's third plenum, the year after he became leader, the reform program that had only recently begun to gather crucial political support persisted by default. The plenum communique stated that the market would play a decisive role in allocating resources. But this was not where Xi's heart lay. As John said just now, his thought, now enshrined of course in state and party constitutions, is on socialism with Chinese characteristics for a new era. This is thus a new era, not Deng Xiaoping's old era. Steadily, as Xi's writ began to rule everywhere, including the economy, the state, or more specifically the party, rode back from its diminished role in the later Hu years to resume its position of centrality. All key upstream sectors remain firmly in party-state control. No one's anymore talking of inviting foreign companies in to take a major role in, say, banking, or talking about privatization. Although reliable billionaires like Pony and Jack Ma are being called on to invest to bail out ailing SOEs. And the oldish socialism of Xi's new era kind of worked at first. China's continuing investment in upgrading infrastructure and in education, and its continuing access to the world's top innovatory technologies, helped ensure that rapid growth continued in that post-GFC era of the first half dozen Xi years. Xi has evolved into a modern Marxist. He doesn't now believe it's necessary to own the means of production in order to control a sector, especially the crucial tech sector. But he's made sure that every organization in China, every Chinese organization outside it too, has a party branch within to help guide policy and choose executive personnel. The two largest private companies in China, Tencent and Alibaba, operate always in ways consonant with Xi's steering, and must respond appropriately to important requests. In return, and it's a very big return, Xi has effectively leased out China's retail distribution and finance to these two corporations. But this is happening as China's three chief drivers of growth over the last dozen years at least, credit, internal migration, and exports, are increasingly constrained. First, credit. China's debt has already surpassed 3 times GDP and has been buying decreased increments in productivity. Since the GFC years, when Beijing launched the biggest stimulus program the world had ever then seen, both the policy concerning credit and the means of achieving it have fluctuated frequently. We've gone through soft deleveraging to boosting back credit in response to the Trump measures, to a kind of parallel fiscal world involving both. As China becomes both capital constrained and yet needs to pump more money into local economies to counter the jobs lost from diminished exports and from COVID constraints at home too. The Belt and Road Initiative has tied up an unknowable amount of capital in loans to countries and projects that may well, especially post-COVID, be unable, certainly unwilling, to repay. The main need now is at home. Thus, the Ministry of Industry and Information Technology is targeting 105 new projects for an average of $1 billion each. The China Development Bank, one of the 2 big lenders also for BRI deals, is being required to provide a further $60 billion for 24 projects. The aim is to shift this stimulus from old infrastructure, whose productivity returns have diminished, towards technological infrastructure. But that shift is encountering consumer resistance. Building a new 5G mobile network with 210,000 base stations by the end of this year is a core aim. But current 4G speeds, and that technology's almost ubiquitous reach, appear sufficient for many Chinese people concerned about their savings and their jobs. China is now, as a result, somewhat capital shy. Its capacity for further overseas investment has become diminished. That's credit. What about internal migration? That has slowed because so is the third driver, exports. The manufacturers that brought the folk from the countryside to the cities, making China the world's factory, are facing tougher times. And such folk are less likely to be employable in the services sector, a services sector that's now being expected to drive growth. And birth rates haven't recovered, despite the abolition of the one-child policy 5 years ago. The working population has been falling since 2014. The decline of remittances from relatives in the cities has caused some people in rural areas, I've learned personally from Chinese friends, to blockade roads, to exact tolls from trucks passing through as their best viable alternative income. Xi Jinping has launched recently a campaign against food waste. We don't know its true driver, but it may be prompted by shortages in domestic food consumption, in domestic food production. Global supply chains are shifting, in part because of rising costs in China, partly due to a desire to diversify sources from a dependence on China to lessen their risk, with China having pursued economic sanctions against so many countries in recent years for political reasons. For instance, Taiwan, for a long time the biggest investor in China and still one of the largest, has in the last 18 months seen $38 billion invested by its high-tech firms that would formerly have placed it in China. Moody's said in a report last week, the pandemic will accelerate the diversification of global supply chains and more manufacturing may move away from China. Premier Li Keqiang, who's normally been a realist in his public statements, warned at this year's National People's Congress in late May that domestically, consumption, investment, and exports have declined. Pressure on employment has risen significantly. There are increasing risks in the financial sector and other areas. And he concluded, China will face challenges like never before. Internationally, China hasn't achieved its desired extension in the use of its currency. The US dollar remains entrenched as the world's reserve currency. Beijing's response has in part been to become the great champion of digitalized currency and the use of blockchain in trade accounting. China already controls 65% or more of the computing power to mine Bitcoin. And now the perfect storm of Donald Trump's trade wars coinciding with COVID-19 is causing a rethink. Though usually Xi's response to challenges is to double down. He's a true believer in the ultimate success of party, of country, and of himself. His new economic template, which he introduced at a Politburo meeting 4 months ago, is called double circulation. The aim, he said, is to fully bring out the advantage of China's super large market scale and the potential of domestic demand to establish a new development pattern featuring domestic and international dual circulations that complement each other. She said this doesn't mean lessening or closing the open nature of China's economy, but it does mean an emphasis on the domestic market and on replacing foreign inputs where feasible. For instance, China today spends more on importing semiconductors than it does oil. So its Made in China 2025 scheme, which has been de-emphasized since the trade wars began, but persisting nonetheless, aims to create a domestic sector that can supply the parts that the giant monopolistic tech companies such as Huawei require. At the same time, Xi is now more seriously starting to accommodate that modernizing economic goal he'd inherited, to steer away from inputs and exports and towards services and domestic consumption. This requires major new thinking in key areas of public policy. Inputs have been supplied chiefly by the state banks, alongside massive local government financing vehicles and now bond issuance, while exports have been driven substantially by foreign-owned manufacturing. To create a more efficient services sector will require foreign inputs there too, and boosting consumption will mean putting more money in workers' pockets and less in enforced savings, including in bloated state-owned corporations. The consumption share of China's economy remains low today, only 39% of GDP compared, say, with 66% in the US. Demand has thus not been playing its full part in driving the economy. Such big and complex changes will take time to digest, especially as now they must be somehow stitched together with the new dual circulation program. And a new 5-year plan, the 14th, which must accommodate all this, is due to be launched early next year. The ANZ Bank's chief economist, Richard Yetsanger, formerly chief economist with HSBC here, has said that rose-colored glasses are required to think that China will overtake the US as the world's largest economy in the next decade. While he expects it to continue to grow for quite some years, the rate of this growth is naturally, Richard says, converging towards the global mean over time. The key resulting question is how quickly, and will that diminish China's crucial capacity to continue weaponizing its economy, its crucial tool in gaining global traction for its worldviews and its influence? Can we, should we, as a result of this natural trend, a maturing economy inevitably slows, think of the PRC no longer as our single essential business partner? Perhaps. We may instead need to start looking at it as one of several or many core business partners. It may mean that our business leaders start to look at China more carefully and intensely and assess risks, political and others, for themselves, rather than expect our government necessarily to do that for them. After all, we did that with Japan and with South Korea when we also signed FTAs with them in the same year we signed our China FTA, didn't we? No, actually we didn't, or not enough. We've been inclined simply to follow bald GDP growth figures. Now that will need to change, as it should have done with Japan. Japan is a large economy with many opportunities, whether it's growing overall at 7% a year or semi-stagnating at 1%. The same goes for Korea. And we shall increasingly need to come to terms with the same applying for China. China is, yes, big. It's diverse. It contains myriad markets. Its opportunities remain many for smart Australian businesses. That won't change dramatically, whether its GDP is rising rapidly as before, or whether it's just ticking over is more likely in the future. I didn't hear many people saying, let's abandon the US because, say, of the GFC, nor should we abandon China because of current trends or events. Part of our disadvantage compared with, say, the US, Germany, Japan, or Korea is that we haven't invested in China. And we have very few chief executives or board members with experience of living or working in China, or more widely speaking, in Asia. We've done very well despite this, but from here on, the going gets tougher. What's the answer? I've read in recent days a couple of Australian business figures saying that while the diplomatic state of play between Beijing and Canberra is discouraging, it's really the equivalent of a married couple squabbling, and we'll settle down and return to normalcy soon enough, given more muted public rhetoric, hopefully. Wang Xining, the deputy Chinese ambassador, said something similar last month. He said, it takes concerted determination and joint effort to make a relationship thrive. A married couple knows this. However, the relationship between Australia and the People's Republic of China is not and never has been like a marriage. Our political, legal and value systems have never been in alignment since the PRC was established 71 years ago. Our relationship is different. My view is that this is a good time for Australians who do business and with in and with PRC counterparts to focus especially strongly on those relationships, to watch more attentively how markets are changing in China and here in Australia, and to adjust business plans correspondingly. Many presumptions are made about the PRC relationship, including that engagement is an end in itself and that understanding will lead to a wish for closer formal ties, although the latter may instead lead to greater guardedness. I argue both for continued engagement, inevitable with a country of the PRC's size and with our multiple levels of contact, including prominently economic links, in a low-key way and for better understanding. The trading relationship, as we see from the data, is not exactly on the rocks. It remains very busy given COVID constraints. But if Australian business leaders are to press for a change in Australian policy regarding the PRC, they need to consider and then articulate why and how they wish this to happen, and especially in what new ways we should engage the PRC, especially bearing in mind that to be effective, this would require a reciprocal response from China. Australian business people are routinely requested by PRC contacts, especially officials in party or government organisations or in state corporations, to replicate traditional talking points. They include to criticise the PRC is to be racist, the Chinese Communist Party can't be separated out from China and the Chinese people whom it's ruled for 71 years, that any criticism of party state policies or actions amounts to vilification, that the rise of the PRC to global dominance, especially economically, is inexorable, and that to criticise the PRC is tantamount to fawning on the US and endorsing Trump. But this is a ritual required by officials. For the most part, genuine business people in the PRC not only choose to lay low themselves, but they prefer their international partners to do the same. Laying low is the preferred option for private Chinese business people themselves in Xi's new era. When did we hear them publicly call for changes in their own government's policies or urge for constraint from wolf warrior diplomats? And this is a time with the PRC facing considerable global pushback as a result of its increased international assertiveness, and with Beijing also feeling under economic pressure as unemployment grows and capital slides. When Chinese business people especially value closer links with trusted partners, providing a welcome degree of predictability. Public combativeness in support of the PRC is not a useful response, however justified you may feel that it is. It instead adds peril, potentially arousing Australian consumers and shareholders to criticise your business or brand and to provoke political antipathy, while only adding to Chinese business counterpart anxiety. The former Austrade chief in China, Michael Clifton, is surely right when he says that too few Australians have developed their formal Chinese business partnerships, which, as he said, demands patience, perseverance, and opportunities for genuine dialogue that encourage more than a perfunctory recitation of well-worn talking points, close quotes. That's a good reason to use this already fraught COVID era to deepen business understanding of clients, suppliers, and markets, to become better informed generally. It's also a time for those doing business with China to deepen relationships with Australia's own highly diverse ethnic Chinese communities, including those who've migrated from the PRC, such as the new generation of entrepreneurs who spoke so interestingly on a recent KPMG Sydney Uni webinar that I saw last month. There's no quick fix that might return the Australia-China relationship to the so-called good old days. Many Australians now feel sufficiently well informed about the PRC's governance to adopt views of their own. These are to a significant degree reflected in positions taken in Canberra, these days largely in consensus by the Coalition and Labor, which reflect concerns underlined by polling, including by the Lowy Institute. It shows that 77% people telling Canberra to preference security, even if it exacts an economic cost. Though also, smartly, I would say, people who polled backed the idea of joint aid projects with China in the Pacific, if we can organise that. Even if we did satisfy some of Beijing's requirements, others would soon replace them. We passed under John Howard, for example, the first test enabling us to start negotiating an FTA, calling China a market economy. But it still took 10 years to complete, and the spirit that underwrote it now appears to be evaporating. Beijing tends to provide its partners with a flow of new tests. It's important in this context to consider empathetically how our Chinese business partners might be feeling right now. If we feel puzzled and chastened, so must they. They've experienced far more directly the impacts of Xi tightening party controls, involving far more meetings, requiring party members and managers everywhere to spend an hour a day answering questions about Xi's policy on the Shuixi Jianguo apps on their mobiles, the manner of Xi's global thrusts souring their relations with international partners, the private sector subject to frequently changing conditions for investing at home or abroad, and so on. Michael Clifton rightly says the change in behaviour of the PLC is a key factor in the waning of business influence. This requires a review by business of how it operates in and with the PLC, in which the Aussie chambers in China, and of course this council, can provide valuable inputs and also reinforcement of relations with key Chinese partners. That's something I've done personally, reaching out a few days ago to my friend Li Jianjuan, who had his Australian visa cancelled for reasons that remain unclear. Jianjuan is an academic at Beijing Foreign Studies University who plays a crucial role in the network of 36 universities, including his own, that have centres of Australian studies. He and I agreed that we should remain friends through this difficult time and continue to do what we can to maintain valued cultural connections between Australia and China in a polite, but definitely not political manner. While I remain only too well aware that another friend, Cheng Lei, remains detained in an unknown place in or near Beijing for unknown reasons for an unknown duration. Finally, as my editor and colleague, Alan Kohler, wrote recently in The Australian, for Australian businesses that have China as their plan A, that means they should start thinking about plan B, close quotes. That doesn't mean they dump plan A though. But he didn't say that. But there does need to be a lot of thinking, studying, and quiet talking going on, especially with our Chinese business partners. Thanks very much, Virginia. And thanks for listening so politely.
Thank you, Rowan. And your comments actually align with the ACBC strategy of China's approach. So I can let people read President David Olsen's comments on our website regarding that, but it's a definite move in that direction. We can now enter into our Q&A session. We do have some written in our Q&A box, but if I could just introduce Matt Schofield, our Victorian President. He has a question he would like to address to you both. Thanks, Matt.
Oh, thanks, Virginia, and thanks, Rowan and John. I suppose my question is more around record trade figures in spite of, Fitz, Huawei, third actions back to December 2009 that most would say are uncommercial, but has never deterred Chinese trade. But at this time, we hit sort of a raw emotional nerve around humiliation and embarrassment that maybe has sort of tipped us over the edge a little bit, and trying to make sure are we missing some sort of distinction between being really strong on security versus being just mindful of embarrassment?
Who'd like to take that on? Rowan, would you like to comment?
Matt, are you referring to the 100 years of foreign humiliation that Chinese people apparently don't want it to be revisited? Is this the?
Oh, it's more along the lines of like everyone who occupies this space, we're very conscious of face, and quite often saying no or pushing back on things is just seen as a negotiation or part of the relationship. But anything that goes to the heart of questioning their integrity or their ability to be independent, or blaming them for a virus, for instance, tends to get a very different reaction. So one doesn't deter trade, but perhaps the other does.
It's very hard to answer that because I don't really have the mind of Xi Jinping, and that's pretty important here, because the change that's happened has happened since his accession, and China is a place that the system is accountable from the bottom up, not both ways, and messages that come from the top are pretty important to see. Certainly, what you're describing is the kind of view that Xi himself is likely to take. And I think it's very important to, I should say to everyone, to take note. You can read what Xi says. A lot of his stuff is translated. If you're not reading Chinese, it's translated into English and it's available. Perhaps most importantly, we see his speech. I was there 3 years ago at the opening session of the party's 5-yearly Congress. I've got it here on my desk. See, I refer to it all the time. And I think the attitude that she takes is, we're kind of relating to what Yang Jiechi, who's the most senior foreign affairs official now on the Politburo, he is, said to ASEAN members at Hanoi 10 years ago, we are a big country and all the rest are small countries, and that's just a fact. But I'm sure Yang Jiechi didn't mean this to bully. The approach is, if you behave in a way that's acceptable to us, in a consonant way, we will make sure that the relationship is steady and that life can go on as before. If you, as you say, Matt, if you step outside the bounds of what we regard as acceptable behavior, then we can change that relationship. The problem is it's not written down. So as I said, we have one test after another after another. We fail this test, then there's another test. We pass this test, then we go on to another. It's very hard for our diplomats. And we've got people involved who are quite skilled. Frances Adamson, the head of DFAT, is, as everyone here knows, she's for some years ambassador in Beijing, and before that has worked in Hong Kong, Taiwan. She's a very accomplished person. Our ambassador in Beijing right now, Graham Fletcher, is a very experienced hand. So people have to work their way through, and it's not easy when you're working with, on the other side, someone who's pushing. I don't know if that helps at all. John, you may have something more useful to say.
I think the question Matthew's asking has often been asked, and has been asked consistently for 5 or 6 years. Sure, Australia had to do that, but did it have to say it like that? And it could be that we could put things better each time, but you can't predict how China's likely to respond around this issue of dignity and humiliation. It doesn't take a hell of a lot to stir that sort of, is it confected? That sort of irritable, that nerve of irritation. Now, looking back, we might have said everything differently, but we'd still have had to do the same things. We still, for example, we do need an independent inquiry into the origins of the COVID pandemic. I'm not sure we've got that, or we'll get it. And it seems to me not unreasonable for Australia and other countries to press for that. Also for China to press for that. Could we have done it better? Probably. But the same applies in every case. And I don't think then we can distinguish so clearly between those matters bearing on the national interest and that appear to be just, as you were suggesting, Matthew, designed to irritate. I don't think anything's designed to irritate in the first instance. I doubt very much that any Australian government minister has set out deliberately to humiliate China. Nevertheless, we are told that that's been the effect for a number of years of our conduct and our comments.
Thank you. And so while we're talking about perception, Kevin Hobgood-Brown, who's probably known to all of you, he asks a question that the key element of improving ties with China is breaking the current cycle of negative public commentary and perception that each country is taking negative actions against the other. So in your view, what steps can be taken to break the negative cycle and lay a framework for a more constructive engagement?
If I could just comment on that, thanks very much, Kevin. As I said in my remarks, I do think there are substantive issues here, and the idea that simply by saying nothing we won't have a problem is not a realistic solution. It's true that there is a negative cycle of commentary, and on Australia's part we have to be extremely careful not to contribute in any way that could be considered racist, even if we didn't intend it to be. But I would suggest in the first instance that we address some of the substantive issues in a considered way. Like, I'd like to propose that the Chinese Communist Party eliminates its United Front Work Department. I don't think that proposal will get very far, but I think it would remove an enormous irritant in the relationship and reduce the cycle of negative comment. But similarly, if China withdraw from its occupation of contested islands in the South China Sea, and withdraw its claim to maritime territories which are not recognised in law, we wouldn't have much negative comment on that matter either. I do think the negative comment comes about because there are substantive issues. As I said, we then scramble to look for things we have in common so that we can say nice things about one another. We find, sadly, there don't appear to be as many as we thought. Now, one of the great advantages we have in Australia is that we have a large, intelligent, engaged Chinese Australian community, many from the People's Republic, as Rowan called out. And I think they'd be, having more Chinese Australians involved in this conversation would probably help considerably on both sides.
So I have to agree with John. I think that a bit of imagination can help here in terms of things that we can do together. And there are areas that we could suggest working together on. Now, whether there's going to be a reciprocation, we don't know, but we can make some suggestions. So two areas that are obvious are climate change and pandemic. And John and I are both members of the advisory board of the new National Foundation for Australia-China Relations. And the first grant that foundation has given out is $500,000 to the Doherty Institute, working with Chinese counterpart body on COVID-related research. So that is happening, and I think that's the kind of thing that we could consider. I mentioned in my remarks that I think that we could actually work together on aid projects in the Pacific Islands, rather than set up the Pacific as a contested zone, I think, which doesn't help the people there and doesn't help us or China. So I think we need to find a new way there, and that might be one location for doing that.
You've actually touched on a question. We were talking about the positivity around those joint projects with China in the Pacific, and Oliver asks a question in relation to the Chinese United Front work across Asia and the Pacific, which is often wrapped up in the Belt and Road projects. And he's saying that Australia's diplomatic spending is currently at an all-time low in that region, or probably generally. Should we be doing more? Should we be spending more in the region? Should we be doing more to engage in the region?
Well, it's terrible. We heard the other month about 60, I think it was 56, 60 diplomatic positions being excised for cost reasons, which seemed to me very strange timing. Of course, I'm not there sitting in Josh Frydenberg's seat when he has to fund the wages, in effect, paying the wages of half of Australia, it seems now. So it's not easy, but I think that we do have to put more into our diplomacy. China has put a massive amount more into that area than it did, and we've seen it's well highlighted double-digit growth in defence spending for quite a few years in a row. The same has happened with Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and as a result, China's influence has increased greatly, and China's developed a cadre of experts on the Pacific Islands. So the ambassador there, Shui Bing, the ambassador in Port Moresby, is a very experienced Pacific hand. You know, we haven't done the same. We haven't invested in that. So I agree with the questioner. Thanks, Oliver.
So if I could just comment on Oliver's question, it does simply first we need to get clear what the United Front is. And if the United Front's operating, or the United Front Work Department, in Southeast Asia and the Pacific, it's working with the Chinese diaspora. That's what it does. I mean, the United Front Work Department does not work with people outside the Chinese diaspora. It doesn't work with Pacific Islanders directly. It works through Chinese communities. And if that's what's happening, it's a highly risky proposition because it places Chinese diaspora communities at risk in the Pacific and in Southeast Asia. And this is a matter of some concern in Southeast Asian countries which have large Chinese diasporic communities. The United Front Work Department is working among them to exercise influence in their country. In Australia, there's been a public debate about this. There's been acute consciousness about the risks of racism and a very determined effort to separate out questions of China, the Chinese government, the Chinese Communist Party, the Chinese people, and Chinese Australians. That's not the case in Southeast Asia. There's, and quite possibly in the Pacific Islands. So there's a real potential of generating not just anti-China, but anti-Chinese sentiment. And that's a very risky way to go for the United Front Work Department. I'm not sure that is what it's doing, but if it were acting in that way, that would be extremely deleterious to China's own national interests. Secondly, around the Pacific, Rowan, my impression is that the Australian government, despite limited resources, is shifting resources towards the Pacific Islands in particular, into the Pacific area. And COVID is a case in point where the Australian government is committed to making available medications and whatever may be available to Pacific Islands first and foremost, including Papua New Guinea. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think there is an attempt of the Australian government, given its limited resources, to shift what it has in that direction, and that has to be commended.
And we're doing it in a remarkably disinterested way. I mean, for example, we're considerably topped up Asia Development Bank money, which is those projects available for open tender. And a lot of those projects that are funded by Australian taxpayers are being implemented by Chinese companies. Quite state-owned companies are winning the contracts and doing it. Quite interesting. I don't think the other way around happens.
Good, thank you. Another question, Rowan talked about the value of lying low or laying low. However, a common mantra recently being promulgated is that we need to stand up for our values in order to have a strong and healthy bilateral relationship with China. And one is reminded of Kevin Rudd's call for Zhengyu. In practice, this seems to manifest with our politicians and leaders castigating China on the international stage and in public forums domestically on issues that China often regards as internal matters. So rarely does this advance our interests, but often erodes the relationship. On the other hand, we have an even stronger and closer diplomatic relationship with the United States. So why do we seem less willing to turn that same critical eye towards Washington's behaviour that undermines our interests, particularly concerning US withdrawals from TPP, the Paris Climate Agreement, the World Health Organization, etc., the policy of America first and the clear disdain for alliances, and more recently, the US mismanagement of COVID-19. We could spend an hour on that. Perhaps if I could throw to John, if you would like to comment.
So you might recall Kevin Rudd did call for Fitzgerald to be a critical friend, and that was rejected by China at the time. It was a subject of acute embarrassment. It's one of those things that was said to have embarrassed China that we should not have done. So I'm not sure that's an instance we should put forward as a model in any way to follow. I guess one of the premises of the question puzzles me. I would have thought, I just read the mainstream press and listen to what Australian opposition as well as government parties are saying. I hear relentless criticism of the United States, of Trump. I wonder, is it the fact that the Australian Foreign Minister is not standing up and condemning Trump? Well, the Australian Foreign Minister is not standing up and condemning China either. I think there's a sense that, you know, all of Australia, the media and everything is anti-China, and then the Australian government is silent on the United States. Well, fair cop. I mean, if you look at the Australian media broadly, there's not a lot of sympathy for President Trump. I think the top Australian journalists have all made it very, very clear in their editorials and the editorial lines of the major newspapers that Australia, well, at least the press, takes serious issue with the United States on all of those issues. Now, the fact is the United States doesn't take offence when we say that, and so it doesn't show up as an issue in the bilateral relations. China takes offence when the Australian media gets involved in a conversation, let alone the government. And, you know, that's part of China's cultural mix. We need to take it into account, but we can't afford not to have a conversation because it might upset, you know, somebody who's listening in. Well, don't listen in. This is our conversation. We need to get this right. We want to work with China long term in an Australian way, and we don't plan to become China or imitate it in the way government directs everything and ensures that all people are silent and knows their place. That's not Australia.
And if I could just add, John, thanks very much. When I was talking about laying low, I wasn't actually suggesting that we ignore our values and put them to one side. What I was meaning was not to jump out of the trench, stand there in the open and insist that Australians should prioritise economic interests over values. And I think that increasingly we've entered into an age where we carry both with us, and they're both of interests and values, both of significance. And to demand that, for example, the government prioritises economic interests over values is an argument that is losing right now, and not really a good one for people in business to be seen to be pursuing aggressively. The laying low means spending our time not watching Netflix, but instead working on our relationships.
Now, a question from Professor Charles Chen here that is rather interesting. Can Australia go back to Prime Minister Howard's way, and that is separating trade from politics and human rights? Can that be done? Should that be done? John, maybe you're smiling. Maybe you'd like to start off.
I can see where Charles is coming from here, and we'd all like to do this, but I think Prime Minister Howard himself has come out and said in recent times that China now isn't the China that he dealt with, that it's more authoritarian and far more prickly. They may not be his exact words, and that much as we'd like to separate trade from politics, it's increasingly difficult. That's not to say we shouldn't try. It does seem to me that the question of separating trade from politics and human rights is a little narrow. Politics is not just relating to human rights or China's domestic politics. On the whole, Australian government does not comment extensively on domestic politics in China. What it does talk about is China's international engagements, whether the Australian government is in agreement or disagreement with China's behaviour, say in the South China Sea or around the Belt and Road Initiative. That's not domestic, that's international. The Australian government tends to comment on that. And that kind of political conversation is very difficult to have now because it can impact on trade, or it can impact on relations, which can impact on trade. In John Howard's day, China didn't have that kind of international presence. It wasn't as if there were a great many international disputes that were likely to arise between Australia and China, simply because China was, well, building its own national strength and looking to itself, and it's done a remarkable job, I have to say, over the reform and opening era. But now that China's pushing out, and it is pushing out, we can't deny that, where we not so much push back, but just speak back, we're told to get back into our box and say nothing, and that we will suffer through trade retaliation or something else. So it doesn't seem to me that Australia in any sense is trying to stop trading with China. It's that Australia's resistance to China's pushing out that's leading to trade problems. So if Charles could possibly ask his friends in China how they might answer that question, I'd really like to hear.
I think that, well, his friends in China will know that they have problems too, as I referred to in my remarks. You know, under Xi Jinping, politics is upstream of everything. So it's upstream of trade, it's upstream of every kind of activity. And, you know, he famously says north, south, east, west, and the center. The party leads all. And this makes it very difficult for the many very polite and well-intentioned Chinese diplomats who've now found themselves being instructed by their foreign minister Wang Yi on National Day last year, October the 1st, you know, you should be imbued with a fighting spirit. So this type of thing makes it very difficult for them to relate in a nuanced way, and some of them do, and they try. They're not going to be promoted. So at that level, very hard to do what the question asks us to do. We can but try. And business to business, we can still do things. We can still do what we can. Thank you.
Thanks, Rowan. I've got a question from our Vice President, Laura Mattiazzi, and I think in this she's possibly looking at the context of the Australia-China Business Council. She's saying that it seems the national security dominates the current narrative in Australia-China relations. What is your view to have the business community involved in conversations at government level?
Isn't it? So I thought the business community is very often involved in conversations at government level. So I don't know. So BCA and state bodies are very frequently consulted and are talking with government ministers, I had presumed. And this seems to be a situation under successive governments. I'm not sure if anything is stopping business, or if maybe business is feeling particularly not being listened to right now. If that's the case, I think make the case, well, say what you have to say publicly, and you'll find there's an audience. But as I said, I don't think there's a huge audience for people who say we just want to make money and who cares about values. I think that's a problem. But I think that I think business, if business has a problem in getting access, I think then should talk about that more broadly.
Just a quick question. I've got Barry White who's asking here about your views on the treatment of international students and researchers from China, particularly over the COVID period, as these people are potential future leaders and are well placed to represent Australian views and values. So what are you thinking about the way they've been treated recently?
Can I say a few words on that? I think this is a serious concern for Australia's international engagements, not just with China, but with South Asia, with Southeast Asia, with other countries, with Nepal, for example, which send large numbers of students to this country. Australian universities, at the best of times, are not great with their international students. The international students don't have the opportunities they should have to mix with others on campus. The universities provide the minimum they need to, but on the whole, they're not actively engaging students in Australian life. Now, with the COVID pandemic, that's only exacerbated an existing problem. I don't think it's created a problem. And it's shown us that we do have a problem and need to do something about it. It's clear that a number of students, for example, in the big cities, and particularly in Melbourne, where there's a major lockdown, really don't quite know how to get hold of the basics. Some students are said to be hungry, and what are they to do about it? They don't know if they're allowed out the doors and so on. Universities, it seems to me, need to take far greater responsibility for the pastoral care of their students. Now, there are all sorts of inhibitions on universities doing that these days because particular people are assigned particular roles. They can't mix the personal with the public and the institutional, and offering to help someone out at home, offering them a meal, could be seen as stepping outside the bounds of what's currently permissible under university regulation. Well, that's just ridiculous. Or if the universities themselves and their staff can't do it, they need to organise their own alumni, friends in the community, families of students in Australia to help students out. And I think there's been a lack of imagination as well as effort in that respect in reaching out to the Australian community more broadly to help international students. And that's an opportunity lost.
That's terrific.
I agree. And I think that this COVID time when there are difficulties in achieving some of that, one would like to see universities rethink how they help international students enmesh with local communities. I think there is a lot of goodwill in communities. I think you find a lot of people through service clubs, worship communities, whatever, who'd be very eager to invite international students to their homes for a barbecue or whatever. I've never heard of this kind of thing happening. And I think we really have to, particularly, I'm sitting here in Melbourne, it's very important for our economy as well, but just in a human sense, it's very important to help those students. And when you come from a group with a lot of colleagues around, like Chinese, if you're a Chinese speaking student, it's natural that you just stay with your own group. But the university's job, it seems to me, is partly to help really encourage those people to move out and get to meet broader range of Australian people. There are ways to do this, and I'd love to see this happen.
Thank you. Well, we're almost at the end of our time. I just have one very quick question, and then I'll hand to Matt to make some closing remarks. James Scullen asks, is the only realistic circuit breaker a high-level meeting between Xi and Morrison?
Oh, no. No, that's not really going to be very useful. There's been a lot said about this, that all we need is for Morrison to do, of course, he'll have to do something to entitle him to get to that meeting. I don't know what, say what or do what, but then he flies to Beijing. He goes to the Great Hall of the People. He walks down a very long red carpet. Xi Jinping is looking in another direction. Morrison bows. Eventually they shake hands. Xi Jinping, I've watched many times these events in the Great Hall. Xi looks over his left shoulder and he goes away. And there may be there's going to be brief talks, but I don't really think that's going to be it. And how you get to it is going to be quite difficult. I think there are many smaller steps that need to happen. I think too much store tends to be placed on those kind of rituals, but that's a Chinese ritual. It's not our ritual, and I think we need to have a shared ritual rather than for us to enter theyrs.
Okay. Oh, Matt, if I can hand to you, please.
Can I just, sorry, one more thing, Virginia, since there's such a wonderful audience of people, if I may dare to ask this question. People have talked about engagement, and I've said I'm a big supporter of engagement, but we need to find new ways of engaging in this era. And please, it would be great if everyone here can think and come up with suggestions. And I think rather than just say, we need to engage, that word isn't enough. We need to come up with both vocabulary and some actions that can be really helpful. So sorry, Virginia.
No, that'd be a terrific outcome. So email acbcvic@acbc.com.au and we will send those on to Rowan and John. Thank you. Over to Matt now to make the closing remarks, and thank you both again.
Yeah, thanks, Virginia. And I think wonderful remarks there from Rowan at the end, which I think, you know, the only good thing that's come out of COVID is it's made everyone realise that values come first. And I think it's forced society to revisit their values, and values preservation is everything. And I think beyond that, it is about execution and how do we work out ways to be better at building relationships, but making sure that values are never compromised. So thanks again to both John and Rowan for their input today. Great leadership shown, and that's why it is the leadership program, talking very strongly to aspects of values and, you know, maintaining a strong society and democratic society here in Australia. So thanks for your input today. Thanks for your insight around what's going on in China. Greatly appreciated. Thanks also to the team, Virginia, for putting on an outstanding event. Thanks for, you know, organising the leadership series. It's something that we need more than ever. So it's, you know, just been a fantastic undertaking by yourself and the team. So thanks again, and well shared today. The next two parts of the leadership series, the first will be in October, where we have Michaela Browning, who's the interim CEO for the National Foundation for Australia-China Relations. So again, we'll get wonderful insights from Michaela. And then in November, we have Jeff Raby, who's the former ambassador to the People's Republic of China. So probably can't get any better insights around all things Australia and China than Jeff. So we look forward to that session as well. So hopefully everyone enjoyed it. Thanks to all of our members for supporting it. And thanks again to John, Rowan and Virginia for putting on such a great event. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Farewell.